Welcome to the Afterwords podcast, where every week we spend some time with teachers from the previous weekend and talk about their message, talk about the passages of scripture that they covered, and sometimes we get to uncover some things that didn't make it into the message. My name's Jason. I'm joined today by Noel and Jordan. What is happening
Let's
here?
go!
This is weird.
Go green.
What's going on?
I'm Noel's emotional support animal today.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
True.
Yeah, comfort blanket.
And I'm really hoping to get a word in edgewise today.
Yeah. I've been told I talk too much. By no one ever.
Is that what that means? That you talk too much, Jordan?
I guess.
By
no one ever.
Okay, so explain, Noel, how this happened. Because normally I do a podcast with Noel or with not Noel. And now today we're doing one with Noel and not Noel.
Yeah, because mostly I just wanted to hang out with Jordan, so I orchestrated this whole thing for that.
That's quite the orchestration.
Yes, we have this teaching spot open at Riotown, and we sort of broke the seal on that a year or so ago with our About That series, or a year and a half ago. And I've only preached live twice at Riotown, and so I just shot a note to Hezekiah and Justin and said, hey, what do you guys think about me preaching live? So it was fun. I have to tell you a great story. So I get there. This little boy walks up to me in the lobby, and he says, Pastor Noel. And I said, hey. And he goes, someone left their poop on the sidewalk. So there you go. So I mean, it's just like
welcome
it's pretty
to
much
Riotown.
Well, I mean, being a pastor is all about hearing all about people's crap and cleaning it up. So it was good. Yeah,
Literally or figuratively.
Either way. Yeah.
All right, so that's a good way to start the podcast. So my first question, actually, Noel, is for you.
Okay.
And we're doing this series. We're calling it Rooms, and we're talking about families. And this particular topic, I think there's a lot to unpack here, but the topic was singleness, and I'm just curious, as you were thinking about the series, why did you pick this particular topic to fit into the series about families?
Well, it is an underserved and undertaught about topic, first of all, and I think that and Jordan did a fantabulous job talking about this, but it's one of those areas that we have these misconceptions about singleness, and we have just overplayed marriage as like the goal. I think you almost called it a finish line or whatever you called it. And that singleness is, the way I described it this week is it's like a waiting room for marriage. And yes, we kind of treat it that way. And yet scripture doesn't treat it that way. And we are living in an age right now where in 2023 was the first time that 50% of Americans were single. And it changed to 49 by next year. Now, 1% didn't run out and get married, but, between births and deaths and marriages and divorce. But we're about half of our culture is single now. So you're doing a disservice if you don't talk to singles.
Yeah, and Jordan, I sensed last night at the Saturday, we're recording this on Sunday after the services, and I was at the Saturday service, and I sensed at the beginning there was a little bit of maybe not apprehension, but just a sensitivity to the fact that this is a challenging topic for a lot of people. And I'm just, as you looked at that topic, you're like, yeah, I'll take that one. How did that work for you? And what were you, how did you really approach it? I agree with Noel. I think you did a really good job of that, but I definitely sense like it feels weighty for some reason.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I actually weirdly did request this before when Noel first told me like, oh, this is a series we're doing. He gave me the list of topics. I was like, I think I want to teach on singleness. And then
he was the first person on the teaching schedule for the series.
Yeah. So just something as I heard it, I was like, oh, that just seems like really important. It seems like a poignant moment for the conversation to happen. Working with college students, like I work with not a lot of married people. I do have some married students, but a lot of people are single or dating, navigating what that all looks like. And it's just like every time I have a conversation with someone, it's like, I feel like I need to unpack some baggage that you have with that or some misunderstanding you have there. But so I was really excited for it. But then the more I was writing and the more I was thinking about it, I was like, man, I could definitely step on a landmine here. And I really don't want to because one, like I don't want to, like it's hard enough being single. I don't want to create more trouble for them, I think a lot of the conversation needs to happen with married people, and I don't want them to feel really like called out. But then also, even as I was thinking more and more, thinking about like widows, and today I talked a little bit this morning about my grandma because I wanted to make sure I included widows because like that's a particularly challenging moment of singleness to re-enter singleness in your 80s. Like, what is that? How do people care for you? And then I was like, man, I think that's why scripture covers this. But it just felt like there was so many sides. I felt like as I was doing mine, I was like hitting on so many different things.
Yeah.
Like my content was so heavy, as opposed to maybe like the application side, like really driving things home. But it was just like, man, I feel like there's so many things I want to touch on because I want people to feel seen. I sent my message to a lot of people just to be like, are there any blind spots? Am I missing anyone? Could anything be heard negatively by someone that has a different experience than me? Because I opened my message by saying, like, I haven't been single. I was last single at 16, or I was not in a dating relationship back at 16, and I'm only 33. So most of my life now has been with the person I'm married to.
Right. Well, it's interesting. You were talking about landmines, and that was like a big struggle in putting this one together. And I think I actually did step on a couple of landmines. I had a line at Rio Town this morning. It was a line of landmines. And so, did you end up having any conversations like that? You hit a landmine?
Not in a bad way. I did have someone come up crying after service last night. And in a way, I pushed on some things that resonated very deeply, and it had a visceral reaction.
And those things are good. I mean, that's not a landmine like it. But that's part of this job is you want things to hit people because you don't want it to be. I've heard that a million times before. It doesn't apply to me. But if it's going to apply to you, it's going to hit you, and it might hit you in a tearful way like that.
One of the things that's interesting is a lot of times the sense I get is, as pastors, when you are teaching and you preach on a subject that is very sensitive to people, it's often because you're calling out something that might be a deep sin or something in their life. And obviously singleness is not a sin. And for a lot of reasons, it has such a deep personal feelings around it. And even though everyone who is married was at one point in their life single, it's very hard to really remember what that struggle would be like.
Yeah. And what I think that when people have that disproportionate reaction to something, and disproportionate positively or negatively, a lot of times there's a wound or an idol. And in this particular area, there's a lot of people, this has been my experience over the weekend, is there's a lot of people with some wounds around their singleness or an idol around marriage. And so those tend to be the things that, kind of trigger that reaction. So when someone comes up to you and I had both mad and sad today. You can just see it's something there.
Yeah.
And so you just got to be tread lightly because, someone could be mad or sad because they're just wounded. If they have an idol, you got to call it the idol. But most of the time in this circles, it's more like a woundedness.
Yeah. Jordan, you did I thought a good job of sort of walking through and touching on some of the history. And it occurs to me that really Paul's teaching in the New Testament and just the New Testament in general, the teaching on singleness was kind of revolutionary in the church, right? The entire Old Testament, not that there aren't examples of single people, but the Old Testament is really like from Genesis 2:18, right? It's not good for man to be alone, and he makes a wife for him. Through the entire Old Testament was like the ideal is marriage, right? And even in parts of the New Testament, Paul writes about the metaphor for the relationship between the church and Jesus as marriage. But Paul was really, I think, not maybe saying something controversial, but it was different to what people were hearing when he was calling out singleness as a gift. And so I feel like the same thing is kind of true for us today because most people grow up in the church. Like I know a lot of churches when I was growing up had like singles ministries, and singles ministries were not ministry to singles. It was like you go here so you can become not single.
Swipe.
Yeah, it's like there were no dating apps back then.
Dating apps, yes.
Right. But in the dating app industry, I actually looked the stat up, is expected to be roughly $19 billion by 2030. Wow. Right. So like this is the thing people are preoccupied with.
Yeah.
And so teaching on singleness as a gift almost feels like it is as countercultural as when Paul was writing 1 Corinthians. And I'm just curious what your thoughts were as you were preparing for that.
Yeah, I just, my friend Pastor Leonce of United Church in Atlanta, last year they did a marriage conference, and then the next weekend they did a singles conference. And they talked about the two gifts. And that seemed so revolutionary to me. And when I heard it, I was like, well, duh. Like, why don't we do something like that? And I think that you're absolutely right. And I think the one nuance I'd say there, you mentioned the word like marriage is the ideal. I think what we have is marriage was the standard in a sense. I don't know if standard is the right word, but the kind
Ideal.
of like yeah. But I think that what Paul basically said is he basically said, no, there's not a ranking of these two. In fact, if there is a ranking of these two, Paul makes the argument maybe singleness is the better option. If you're going to rank these two. So the ideal might actually be singleness rather than marriage if you want to weight it according to how he does in 1 Corinthians 7.
And how do you think, what was he weighting it based on? Your ability to serve?
Well, what he was waiting on in 1 Corinthians 7, he basically just says, life is complicated if you're married. That's essentially the bottom line argument is your life is going to be more complex and more complicated if you're married. If you can reduce that complexity and leverage that for the sake of gospel mission, that is a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe this is going to be the comments that I make that I get.
Let's go.
These are my
landmines.
Let's do it.
But I think throughout marriage was this ideal not because marriage was better, but because the growth and the flourishing of God's community was the most important. So pre-Jesus, the way that God's community would grow would actually be through having kids. And the flourishing of the people would come that way. Paul is coming
the flourishing of the Israelites.
The flourishing of the Israelites would be through reproduction.
Yeah.
You'd grow your community. You'd be a good parent. You'd grow them up so that could continue to be replicated. But Paul is now at this moment where the growth of God's community doesn't have to come that way.
That's such a good
word. You
word.
can actually expand in these other ways. And he's like, actually, we need single people because we need families and other communities to be transformed, and one of the best ways you might have unique opportunity to do that as a single person. And this is a brand new era of the church. We can actually grow through evangelism as opposed to just through
Wow, that's really good.
So maybe no landmine. I don't know.
It might be a landmine, but it's a landmine I'm going to stand next to you on.
Right,
that's
cool.
Great. That's really well said.
Yeah. So what? At Tony's message, Tony wasn't able to be here with us.
Oh, we have a quote from Tony.
No, it's not a quote, but
no, I have a quote from Tony.
Oh,
I
you
said,
do?
Yeah, I said, are you going to be at the podcast? He said, no, I have a meeting. I told him I'd quote him.
That's the quote.
That's the whole quote.
Okay.
So he's a part of this.
So he's a part of this.
Well, what I was going to, Jordan, you started out talking about how you tapped on widows, for example. There are a lot of different forms of singleness, right? We typically think about, and you work with college students, that's the most obvious group of single, right? People who are not married yet.
Yeah.
Then that's probably how they think about themselves, right? I'm single because I'm not married yet. But marriage is still sort of the goal. But there are a lot of other types of single people. And Tony, he just referred to you could be single and frustrated, meaning you desire marriage, but you haven't found the right person. You might be satisfied. You're fine being single. You might be uninterested. You've had bad experiences with relationships. Or you might be single and grieving. You were married and you're now a widow, or you're divorced, or something has happened. And so there is a wide swath of what singleness actually means in the church. And the church tends to just focus on the not married yet, I think. And you both sort of talked about how part of the problem is marriage. I think, Noel, you referred to it you talked about the wound or the idol, and marriage is often an idol. We put that in a situation I have to conform to that. And I'm just curious, in light of the fact that singleness takes a lot of different shapes and forms, how did the church get to the point where we've made an idol out of marriage and made people who are single feel like they are less than?
Walk through the church history stuff that you did in your message a little bit, because I think that helps explain this moment.
Yeah, so we already touched on, pre-Paul, rabbinic Jewish history, rabbis expected to be married, general expectation, not a requirement. We have Paul pushing back on that. And then we have kind of this, the monastic era swing back in the first century. The first century, I think that was, where there was not wide across all communities, but there were the nuns and the monks. There was this monastic era where they retreated from society. They saw celibacy as a way of this deeper connection with God, and that if you could separate yourself and you could really focus in on that, then it almost became maybe not the most common thing, but it was holier to do something like that.
Even press pause there. Even there's, and I can't remember what year it was or which pope it was, it just basically mandated all Catholic priests become celibate and forced divorce across the entire the priesthood.
Yeah.
It was the probably the history's largest forced divorce.
Yeah. I have that around the 12th century. I think
I can't remember the Pope who did that. Yeah, but it was wild.
Yeah.
Let's keep going through the history of it.
12th century we have that vocational celibacy, clerical celibacy for priests, and then you come into the 16th century and the Reformation, where it's like family. We need the theology around family. We need to see this like equal playing field, where the family needs to be centered and developed. That is something deeply important to God, that we see that throughout Scripture, and then I think it was meant to bring it back to the even playing field, and then since then maybe we have slid more where marriage supersedes single.
It was Pope Innocent II, according to ChatGPT.
There you go.
Just know that.
Yeah, very good.
Which is sort of an ironic name, I guess, to force a bunch of people to be divorced.
Yes, exactly.
But so Noel, you talked, and we actually, it was interesting. I read your message because I didn't have a chance. I couldn't be in multiple places about the passage where Paul is essentially saying, it's better to be single, but if you're burning with desire, you should go get married. The thing is, I feel like in the Bible's definition of singleness here is anyone who's not yet married. As humans in a Western culture, we don't think of singleness that way. We think of singleness as not having a partner.
Yeah.
We don't think of it as not being married. But it did occur to me, and I've had several conversations or heard people recently talking about who were single, they were not married, but desperately want to be. And the challenge of hearing someone to say, like, if you burn with desire, you should just get married. It's like, yes, I'm trying. I would really like to become married. And the reason that I feel like that bubbles up to the top, I can remember in college, I had a good friend who said something along the lines, and they weren't quoting scripture, so they could be completely off base, but it's like, I feel like if God wanted me to be single, he would have given me a peace with that. And it feels like Paul had a peace with that. A lot of people don't. And how do they reconcile that? Like, I really want to be married, and you're telling me I should have this, like, be okay with the fact that I have this gift, but it does not feel like a gift.
Yeah, well, gosh, you've
I know, I said a lot of things.
At least 3 or 4 questions.
That's
in
what
there.
we do on this podcast.
Yes, but so here's what I'd say is it is better to marry than burn with desire is not a one-way street of one individual struggling with their sexual temptation, but a couple together trying to figure out, like, the two of them just, are struggling with desire for one another. I think that's the read there. We should never measure God's will based on peace. And this is one of those things that the evangelical church has just screwed up with by saying, I have a peace in my heart about this. That is not evidence that God is condoning what you're thinking. Because the number of times people use peace as a weapon with me, where they come to me and say, well, God, I have total peace about this sinful decision I'm making. And I said, yeah, but I have Bible. And so that's problematic. The third thing that hits, and I'd love to have any of your responses to all this, but the third one is, this is your last question is always, what didn't you get into? What I didn't have time for, and it was one of the hard conversations I had today, was to spend time really unpacking that piece of the marry and desire and burn and that whole thing, and what does that mean, and how that's been weaponized by some people against others. Like, it's been weaponized by husbands against their wives. It's been weaponized by engaged couples or dating couples of why they have to force somebody into getting married. There's a weaponization of that is wildly inappropriate and sinful. And I didn't have time to really get into that. That kind of came back to bite me. That was a landmine. I didn't address it enough, and I wish I had. That and I just didn't have time to unpack that. But I think that is a tricky part of this passage, because it's part of the wonkiness in the purity culture that was probably between our ages, was the purity culture thing, and it got messy.
Yeah.
So for you, when you think about this idea that, okay, singleness is a gift, I'm single, it just doesn't feel like a gift. How do you help people to sort of wrestle through that?
I don't know that I would use the word gift. I think it's an opportunity. I think as any, like a gift almost seems like it's that ease component, that it's gonna be easy. Like, oh, a gift should be easy.
Like a gift is fun. We like
a
gifts.
gift is fun. Like a gift makes sense. A gift is going to make my life better or easier. I think singleness is an opportunity. It's a different kind of opportunity. I think once we start using gift, we start ranking things as by value. And I think there's a unique opportunity within singleness to do different types of things, for God to round you out in a more well-rounded person, or balance you in a way. Like, I think one of the gifts, I would say gifts of the church, is that we have single and married people, and single people are formed in a different way than married people. Or singleness can form you in a different way than marriage can form you. And that when the church has both of those, we're more well-rounded. We can like almost balance each other. So the church needs people who are single. The church needs people who are married. Not saying that someone has to stay in one camp or the other forever, but that there's a unique opportunity to be formed and developed by the Lord in a different kind of way in those different seasons. And I think God is a God of invitations, not like there's some commands, there's some directives, but a lot of it is like, here's an invitation. Are you going to take it? Yes or no? And I think you can be single and refuse the invitation that is within singleness, or you can be single and accept that invitation to growth, to deeper intimacy with Christ, to all of these different invitations that can come up in the same way that marriage is as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, I wrestled through what you were sharing here because Paul does use the word gift.
Yes.
And so if Paul uses the word gift, I'm still going to use the word gift and try to wrestle with what does that actually mean. And where I came is I landed with opportunity. The gift is the opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think you're right in that. And but I think the way I think of it in my mind is when my kids were little, I had to teach them how to accept a gift they didn't want. And accepting a gift that they didn't want, the cliche is to say to them, you know, it's the thought that counts. And it feels super trite, but I think it applies here more than anywhere else. God gives you a gift of singleness when you're single. He gives you the gift of marriage when you're married. And you could be in one of those and wish you were not. And it is the thought that counts, which means God has an idea in mind for you. Will you take that opportunity?
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really striking to me is Paul interweaves in this passage this idea of singleness and marriage, and he gets into our sexuality. And something that struck me while I was preaching this morning, it hit me harder while I was preaching than I was prepared for, so I still haven't fully unpacked it, is I think we can, with both our marriage and our singleness, with those gifts, our use of our sexuality can blunt the gift. So if you have an opportunity, like you're a single person, and you have an opportunity for the sake of the gospel to really do some stuff, but you're constantly jumping from bed to bed, or you're constantly trying to fulfill you think that the full true fulfillment comes through your full expression of your sexuality. What you're doing is you're just cutting off the use of the opportunity, disappears because you've cut it off. And so that is something that I realized it as I was preaching it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's here. And so I haven't fully put my hands around that. But I think in both our singleness and our marriage, our appropriate use of sexuality has ability to hinder, or it has the ability to further the gift that we have and the opportunity that we have.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One that just came up as I was thinking about this. So I don't ask this because I disagree with anything you just said, but was there a specific situation that Paul was trying to deal with in 1 Corinthians 7?
Yes, but we don't know what it is.
Okay.
Because it all starts, he starts in verse 1 by saying, now in response to the matters that you guys wrote about.
Yeah.
In other words, something about, and the question that they quoted what they wrote to him is, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So that was part of a letter written to Paul. And so he's like, Okay. Now, that was probably a much larger treatise that through the Holy Spirit we only get to have one sentence of. But all of this conversation on singleness and marriage and sexual purity and all of that was a response. It was like he was doing a summer series in his church where people got to submit the topics, and then he tackled them.
What a bright idea. That'd be an
What
amazing
an, what an inspired idea.
Only
The
they had
unfortunate
QR
thing
codes.
is, if you haven't already submitted a topic, it's too late by the
It's
time
too
you heard
late.
this, but thank you for everyone who did. Okay. So my other question was, as this is a two-part question, which is Noel's favorite, what as a church can we be doing to affirm people who are single so that they don't feel like they are second place? And then the second part of the question is just as individual, especially as like married people. I was really struck by Alyssa, who hosted on Saturday night, talking about like the experience of a single person being invited to have a relationship with married people. Oftentimes it's like, we need a babysitter and you probably don't have anything to do. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah, that's a fail. Like what on earth? Like, so I'm just curious, like as a church organizationally, what we can do. And then all three of us are married. So I'm just, and a lot of people listening to this are married. What can we be doing to be self-aware enough to realize that we may not understand that experience and can help minister?
Yeah. I think one that I hear mentioned, so I'm also married, no kids. So even from my wife and I's perspective, the examples used in sermons, I think, is a big one. The number of times that they're kid specific or married specific, that oftentimes we like, if we create our typical person, we generally think of married with kids within the church, and that's almost our like framework. And I think sometimes it's similar how a lot of so like Bible translations that use man instead of man and woman or people, where it's like some people might have to do that translation in their head. They're like, oh, I have to include myself. Or worship songs that are like masculine in nature, and it's like, oh, I have to like swap the word to now include myself. And I think single people have to do that a lot. They're doing that gymnastics when we set our definition as this one thing, and they're like, I constantly have to translate it, and I have to decide that I also belong in this analogy, as opposed to like, I am in the analogy because it was laid out that way. So I think just being intentional of like the way we default. We often, I think as a church, like church, Big C church, default to married as the default. And I think normalizing analogies or references, comments that honor that. I think spaces, creating spaces, not a dating app, but
That was an idea floated last night.
and I think like platforming people who are single, I think is a big thing. So like I can't make this call, but like the elder team is all married people, and it would be amazing. I think it would be an amazing thing to have a Riv elder who is a single person, a single man. And I think having more and more hosts being able to lead, and I know we have like women who are mentoring, and they are a single woman who is mentoring young people, and I think that's an amazing thing. So like almost platforming, putting those people not as like, oh, you're a server, a volunteer, but like we want more people to learn from you, because there's, I mean, in the same way a single person can learn from married people, married people can learn from single people, and the more opportunities we have for people to learn from the wisdom of a single man or a woman, I think as a church we'd be benefited by that.
Well, if you talk about celebrating and honoring diversity, one of the diversities is single versus married. Not versus, singles and married.
Yeah. For you, what else are ways we can?
No, I actually looked at Jordan because I think Jordan has done such a really good job thinking about it, and has probably thought more deeply about it than I have. So any of the answers I came up with would be sub your answer.
So just put you down for the same.
Put me down
Got
for the
it.
same.
Okay. All right.
Ditto.
Last question for both
Hard
of
to
you.
get a word in edgewise.
I know it's my
There we
life,
go.
man.
It happens.
You're just taking all your good answers. So we'll do this more often. So last question is, Noel, you touched a little bit about what you didn't get to talk about. Just anything else you wanted to say about that? And then Jordan, for you, anything that you had to cut?
So for me, I didn't get to cut this, but you didn't get to see it in the notes that you read, because it's the thing that I grabbed onto yesterday morning when I was doing my final draft that really struck me. And it's this. It's that, Jesus tells us in Matthew that when we're in heaven, we will neither be married nor given in marriage. And there's a lot of debate about what that means. But we also know that the church becomes the bridegroom of Christ. So it's almost like this flip that when we get to the continuation of this life in the afterlife, Jesus is going to have, the next time Jesus drinks wine is going to be at the marriage feast of the Lamb, where Jesus is the bridegroom and the church, which is all of us, is the bride. And there's a sense in which the church will be married, but we as individuals won't be married, but the church will be married to Jesus. We will have now that thing that so many long for in their marriage or in their singleness. We long for this perfect spouse, this perfect partner. We'll have that in Jesus, and that will be the one marriage. And so there is a sense in which we will go from, as individuals, for those of us who are married back to single in glory, while we as a church community together will be married to Jesus in that sense. And it really just struck me, and I spent most of Saturday just thinking about that and all the ramifications of that. But it was powerful to think that this gift of singleness and this gift of marriage is one that is moved around a little bit over the course of our life. And even for those of us who are single our whole life, through the church, we will one day experience the ultimate marriage in glory. That's the one thing that really hit me yesterday.
Yeah. Mine's probably more of I went on a rabbit trail. That may have led to a controversial wondering. So it did not come anywhere near my sermon.
Okay.
I feel like that's the way to set it up.
It certainly is.
Yes. So I was delving in a little bit to like church history and singleness and thinking about like, okay, so like the Jewish era. So we have Paul, who was a Pharisee. I was like, okay, but he's single and he's like promoting but then like this rabbinic era is like encouraging marriage. So I was like, okay, so like what? So I was like, I want to dive into Paul's background, so I started the rabbit trail of like, Paul's single, right? And as I was delving in, it's like Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin. Most likely he like makes reference to like casting his vote against Stephen. And traditionally, marriage was a requirement of a member of the Sanhedrin. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So there's a possibility. So this is why I didn't come near my sermon, because I'm not getting into this.
This is good stuff, man.
But there's a possibility that at
podcast.
some point Paul was married. So then reading Paul's wisdom of singleness through the lens of like, is he a widower?
Maybe he's experienced both.
Maybe he has experienced both. And that opened up a whole can of thoughts that I was like, I don't have space in my sermon for this. And there's no there's no solid anything. It was hard to find too many people that have really talked about it. But there's a possibility that Paul had experienced both, and that what we're hearing from Paul is with maybe a more nuanced experience than we would generally enter in with. So
that's good stuff, man.
Yeah, I wish you would have told us that at the beginning of the podcast.
I know.
We would have taken a whole different direction.
That's really great.
We would have just talked the whole time about
it was quite the can of worms. The one other thing I wanted to add, because I made a joke last night while Noel was there at my Saturday night one, and it grew this morning, and I feel like I need to maybe confess a little bit. But
let's hear the rest of the joke.
I shared a quote from Saint Jerome, a monastic era monk, who said, "Marriage replenishes the earth, virginity fills paradise." Controversial quote. I am not endorsing that, but I was like, that's the kind of mug that Noel would have.
Yeah.
Today, I did say, if anyone would like a t-shirt or a mug, they should email noel@rivchurch.com. I'm just clarifying on the record that was a joke, but I really hope someone emails.
I am certain somebody will email me.
Yes.
Probably already.
Probably already.
Yes. I thought about maybe just, not telling you that
Just
until you
letting
get
it
the
happen.
emails.
I'd like to place my order.
Yeah, there we go.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for your time. I appreciate it. It was a great conversation. And for all of you who are listening, we appreciate you as well. And we will talk to you again next week.